Good morning, everybody. Matin va Harston. Welcome to day 2 of the Scottish Land Commission Conference, Land Connection 2021, with this discussion panel on the topic of community wealth building and the role of land. It's great to see so many people signed up to this session. My name is Lorne MacLeod, and I'm one of the Scottish Land Commissioners. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion this morning and introducing you to our excellent speakers. However, firstly, just some housekeeping rules. I'm very grateful that we have some helpers in the background looking after all the technical issues. Please be aware that this event is being recorded, including the chat and the comments section. The video recording may be published on our YouTube channel, so a note has popped up in your screen at some stage there. Please have a read of the details on this for more information. As a result of this discussion panel being recorded, I've also been told to be very strict with timekeeping. Can I now give an overview of the format of the session? We'll start firstly with a 5-minute introductory comment about community wealth building from each of our speakers. Secondly, then some questions from me to the panel. And then thirdly, I'll pick up questions from you, the audience, from the chat function to pose to the panel. And finally, some concluding remarks from myself. Can I ask that when you are putting forward questions in the chat function, you state who the question is for, or if it is for the whole panel. Please note that time is tight and that we may not get round to answering all the questions in the chat, but you are welcome to email info@landcommission.gov.scot with your questions after the session, again stating who it is directed to, and we will endeavour to answer that for you. And finally, a short survey will be sent to all attendees following this discussion panel, and it would be great to get feedback from you. So now moving on to the subject of the panel discussion itself, community wealth building is an approach to economic development which redirects wealth back into the local economy and places control and benefits into the hands of local people. Interest in this subject is growing rapidly in Scotland, with 6 key pilot areas in development across the country. Community wealth building has 5 key pillars, one of which pertains to land and property, and that is of the greatest relevance to today's discussion. It is also worth noting that the Scottish Government's recent programme for government has committed to introducing a community wealth building bill. Can I now move on to introducing the speakers? We have Neil McInroy, and Neil is a senior fellow for the Global Advancement of Community Wealth Building at the Democracy Collaborative. He was previously the Chief Executive of the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, and he is also a community wealth building advisor to the Scottish Government. We have Liz Miller-McEntee, and she is an experienced senior manager, board director, and a passionate advocate for economic and social justice in Scotland. Liz has worked extensively in the third sector, economic development, and also further education. She is the chair of the Economic Development Association Scotland, EDAS. And also we have Joe Cullinane, is a councillor and leader of North Ayrshire Council. Within the council, he is responsible for community wealth building, as well as budgeting and the Ayrshire Growth Deal. He is also chair of the North Ayrshire Community Planning Partnership and Ayrshire Regional Economic Partnership Board. And also to mention that North Ayrshire Council is the first council in Scotland to adopt community wealth building. So with these introductions, can I now pass to Neil McInroy to kick off with his 5-minute introduction slot. Over to you, Neil.
Thank you, Lorne, and good morning, everyone. Delighted to be here, and thanks for the great work that Scottish Land Commission does and continues to do for Scotland. So thanks very much for that. I'm a Community Wealth Building Advisor with the Scottish Government and the Economic Development Directorate, and also a Senior Fellow working with the Democracy Club of an American Research and Development Lab. And we're advancing community wealth building in a number of places across the US, including Chicago and rural Pennsylvania. So what is community wealth building? Well, basically, Scotland's adopted it as a practical means to deliver on its well-being and inclusive growth aspirations. And in Scotland, I suppose elsewhere in the world, there's a sense that we've had the traditional regeneration or traditional economic development, and obviously that works well, but it's seen that this goes a little bit further. It's a maturing of that agenda to actually dig deep into the systemic elements of how an economy works and who it works for. And in that, wealth, I'm an economist, wealth is a defining feature of all economies. Who has it? Where does it go? And how do more people get their hands on it, I suppose, the fundamental features. Now, traditionally in Scotland and elsewhere, we've thought about redistribution of wealth. That is where you get the growth and then you redistribute it, transfer payments, welfare, and so forth, redistribution of wealth. What community wealth building looks at is what is called pre-distribution. It actually considers how do we think about wealth during economic production, not just after, but actually as economic activity actually takes place, before and during economic activity. So it's redistribution and this pre-distribution. And so the approach of Scotland has kind of three interconnected elements. One, as Lorne alluded to, has a number of elements to community wealth building, has touch points with different policy areas that I'll touch upon very briefly in a minute. So we in Scottish Government work in how does it fit with other policy areas, including questions of land. Secondly, there's the 6 pilot areas that's been advanced across Scotland, as well as many other areas that are doing it on their own steam, not out with of support from the Scottish Government. And then it's about movement building, growing awareness and interest across a range of public institutions, society, businesses and economy. Just to, in my final few comments, just to say, what are the key elements of community wealth building in terms of those pillars? If we think about wealth as like plumbing, flows of water, yeah? Let's think about wealth in that way. There's 5 key pipes that we think of in terms of wealth. One is financial wealth. How is that flowing through our people, our communities, our places? Spending, particularly public spending. How making sure that spending, probably worth about 35% of the whole Scottish economy, comes from public spending. How is that flowing through into communities, into people's pockets, into places? The third one is workforce. So it's like what people get paid and fair work agenda, land and property, and also questions of ownership. Ownership, a key pre-distributive element here. How are we making sure that people own more of the actual economic activity that takes place? And turning finally to the question of land, I would say, personally, the moral case for land reform and changing the nature of land ownership in Scotland has been made. The challenge here now is to consider the economic case and how land ownership and stewardship is the basis to a new economy, a well-being economy in Scotland. And community wealth building is a key vehicle in that. The other thing to think about here in terms of land is a reconsideration of how we use land for food production, energy production, carbon capture, ecological use, natural assets, and how do we land economic activity on top of that land, and how wealth is accrued and harnessed by our communities with that economic activity that takes place. The recircular nature of the value that comes from land, and how does that flow through our communities and places. We also need to think about land in terms of the intermediaries that sit there around land, that support land development, the ecosystem of consultants and specialists. How do we make sure that that ecosystem not only supports this different sense of accruing value in land, but also how does that them entities themselves are owned more by the Scottish people? I'll finish up there. I think that's my 5 minutes. Thank you, Lorne.
Thank you very much, Neil. That's a very comprehensive introduction. I'll now pass to Liz for her 5-minute slot. Over to you, Liz.
Hey, good morning, everyone, and thank you for the warm welcome, Lorne. I'm really delighted to be here today contributing as EDAS chair. And I've been very much enjoying actually the conference sessions that I've managed to catch so far. And the conference started yesterday, so been really some fantastic input and discussion so far. And I'm also delighted to have been working directly with the Scottish Land Commission in recent months as the EDAS representative on their community wealth building and land steering group, and also to have been working closely with Shona Glenn, who of course is heads up policy within Scottish Land Commission and is a board member of our EDAS board. I'll start with a brief introduction to EDAS, the Economic Development Association for Scotland, for those of you who are unfamiliar with who we are. EDAS was established over 20 years ago and has been the main membership body supporting and representing those working in economic development in Scotland throughout this time. With over 3,200 members across the country, and this is a growing membership, we've seen it grow considerably actually during the last year and a half with the pandemic. The majority, 96% of our membership, work in the public sector. And as Neil made that really good comment there, that very telling comment, you know, the 35%, you know, of the land owned is in fact based in the public sector. So we have an important membership base that actually aligns and connects with this agenda that we're about to be talking about today. But we've got a trusted membership and a trusted reputation for delivering high quality events and spaces for dialogue, which attract top academics and experts every year, policy briefings, knowledge sharing and practitioner-led networks, and university level CPD courses and learning opportunities to support the needs of Scotland's economic development community. We aim to encourage learning, networking, new collaborations and good practice through the many events that we offer each year, now of course all online. And these events have evolved over the last few years to include a series of communities of practice, which enable groups to come together to consider particular themes in more depth. Now, one of these is focused on, and I'd have to say, it's fair to say, really taken off around community wealth building, working closely with Neil over the last year, with CLES when Neil was working there, but we're continuing that relationship, and with the Scottish Government and the Scottish Centre for Regional Inclusive Growth. And we're just about to finalise details for our new programme on community wealth building events, which will start in November. So I would ask you to please check out our website and sign up to our EDAS events to hear more about this, because we'd really welcome your involvement in these events. To provide a bit of background on me though, I took on this role a year and a half ago during a period of transition for our organisation, where we had begun to broaden our thinking, connections and priorities in order to widen the scope of contributions and membership. This included encouraging conversations with people who might not self-identify as working in economic development, but who could nonetheless contribute in this field and are working to support an economy that works for all of Scotland's people and communities. Now, my career, as Lorne said, has spanned third sector social enterprise, social housing, as well as education and economic development. So in taking on the chair role, I'm genuinely really committed to ensuring a broader focus for EDAS on inclusion, well-being, equality, tackling poverty and local regeneration, as well as our more traditional priorities of support to key growth sectors, business development and internationalisation. We're clear at EDAS that economic development is changing in line with the massive shifts that are taking place in the world around us. The landscape has altered dramatically and pace over the last year and a half, but even before COVID, it was clear for a very long time that the economy was not working for many. The pandemic has only exposed further the fault lines of inequality that exist across Scotland, and land asset and ownership and access plays a significant part in that. Our EDAS members have been at the forefront in mitigating the economic impact of the pandemic and Brexit at the same time on people, businesses and key sectors, developing responses to the fast emerging green economy and the jobs and business research and investment opportunities arising from these, and in seeking to realise this vision and aspirations of a just transition, and in dealing with the physical impact of the pandemic on our cities and towns and loss of revenue income streams over the last year. The pressures and complexities in the economic development community at the moment are complex and enormous. People have had to deal with change as never before, and it's our role in EDAS to support our members to understand and navigate this new landscape and to be inspired that they can bring about change and have real impact in the work they do. So to support this, earlier this year, we created a new strategy which set a vision for a Scotland that is a sustainable, prosperous and inclusive economy, bringing economic, social and environmental well-being to all of its people and communities. and also that those delivering economic development have the optimum skills and knowledge to support and implement this vision. Our strategy focuses on 3 themes: people, place and planet, all of which have resonance and connection to the work of the Scottish Land Commission. And indeed, this has led us to create a collaborative partnership with the Commission in recognition of the shared interests that we hold. We recognise the need to work in partnership with new sectors to break down silos, both internal and external, and to collaborate in new ways. Community wealth building plays a massive role in achieving our ambitions, and that's why we're enthusiastic to champion it as a core part of our learning programme. It offers a different way to do economic development, which should shape and inform economic development planning and delivery across all areas of Scotland. It provides a mechanism to ensure local places access, generate and retain local wealth in order to create jobs, employment and businesses, develop skills, tackle poverty, health and well-being, and ensure environmental sustainability. I mean, what's not to like in all of that? And it's also democratic, devolving power and decision-making to local level and fostering collaboration and genuine partnerships. Our work is seeking to support that aspiration, and it includes a focus on the cultural shifts and leadership needed to make this happen. This can be challenging because partnership requires the building of trust, the ability to listen to voices that may not be the norm in planning and decision-making, looking at responsibilities and the relinquishing of power, assets and capital, and it also involves a shift in mindset, leadership and culture. This is something I'm really keen for EDAS to focus on too, through open and honest conversations in our events and practice communities. How can community wealth building be at the heart of economic development? How can it be mainstreamed? How can we support future leaders in economic development to inspire and enable this? So whilst it's a challenging time to be working in economic development, it's also an exciting one full of opportunity. And I really welcome the views of the audience today as we take this agenda forward, because it will help to shape what we do and who we speak to in the months ahead. So thank you very much. And I hope I didn't do too far over my time.
No, excellent, Liz. Thank you very much for that. And it's good to see what EDAS, yourself and your member organisations are doing in promoting community wealth building. So thanks for that. We'll now pass on to Joe for his introductory comments. Over to you, Joe.
Okay, thanks, Lorne, and thank you for the invite today. The pressure is on. Neil McInroy managed to speak for 5 minutes. I've never heard him be so short and brief, so pressure's very much on me now. I'm going to just kind of try and give some examples of community wealth building in action in North Ayrshire. I think Neil's already set out some of the sort of thinking and theory behind it. He did speak about the 5 pillars briefly, the first one being procurement, and I think that's where so much of the community wealth building focus has been up to now. Certainly if you look at the early articles which highlighted the work being undertaken in Preston, it very much focused on procurement and spending more of that procurement spend with local businesses. But I think, as Neil said, the fundamental issue we're trying to tackle with community wealth building is the economy, who owns it and in whose interest is it run. There's many more levers than procurement at our disposal to turn the dial on the local economy, and certainly publicly owned land and assets is one such lever. I think what we've seen throughout the years of austerity is an approach which has been solely about property rationalisation. We've seen budgets being cut and public sector bodies have only seen the monetary value of their publicly owned land and assets to try and get a capital receipt, get it off the books, bring in some money and square the problems with budget cuts down the road. But that doesn't take account of the social and economic value of land and assets that are publicly owned. And it also doesn't protect an asset which does have value to the public, and once it's sold, that value is lost. So I think with community wealth building in terms of land and assets, what we are talking about is raising our game, and it's about putting it back into productive use with the common good at its heart. Some of that will mean transferring ownership of land and publicly owned buildings to the community, and we've got some examples of that happening on the ground in North Ayrshire. We have a community investment fund which is accessible for community groups and organisations to tap into, and we've seen some groups use that to take on ownership of key sort of strategic assets in their local area. One of them is on the Isle of Cumbria, where there's a charity taking ownership of the Millport Town Hall. They've now got £2.5 million in the bank, and they are restoring the town hall into a productive facility for the island. Another project, which is a smaller scale but still significant, over a £500,000 investment, is at Salkits train station. There was a disused part of the train station. It's now been transferred into the ownership of the local karate club, with funding from the council and other external sources have turned it into a phenomenal training facility, not just for the karate club, but for the wider Salkits community. It also means retaining land and buildings in public hands rather than just selling it, and thinking about how you might use it differently. So for us, that means looking at our allocation of sites for council housing. We've got a big council house building programme in North Ayrshire, and it's included us taking ownership of sites and the ownership of other public sector bodies, such as NHS Ayrshire and Arran, and Police Scotland, where we've taken ownership of Largs Police Station, and we're going to convert that into council housing. It also means looking at a different model for private housing development. We have got loads of publicly owned land in and around North Ayrshire. We don't want to sell that to a volume builder and see the benefits of that extracted from the local communities. We're looking at how we can maybe set up some sort of construction arm of the council to develop private housing ourselves, retain the financial benefits that we can then use to support our wider communities, and also offer direct employment and better terms and conditions for those who work on those sites. Neil spoke about allocating land for climate change action as well. So we're allocating significant chunks of land for tree planting. And we've also got plans to convert our 2 former landfill sites into council-owned solar farms. These solar farms will generate 2/3 of the council's energy. It will reduce our carbon emissions by 850 tonnes a year, and it will deliver about £25 million of financial surplus back into our coffers. Final point I maybe want to mention, Lorne, before I open up to questions, is the fact that we do have a lot of vacant and derelict land in North Ayrshire. It is a industrial area which has a really strong industrial heritage, and obviously in the deindustrialisation in the 1980s, a lot of that went into disuse and has lay vacant and derelict since then. Big problem for us. We are taking action to try and bring some of those big sites back into use, using stuff like the Ayrshire Growth Deal. We've got a big site at Ardrossan, which was the former Shell site, Ardrossan North Shore. We've got £170 million of investment going into that site to put it back into productive use. We now own that site, so we've brought it back into council ownership. But it's got a whole range of sort of investments going to take place here, including a new school campus. We have Hunterston as well. Now that is currently owned by Peel Ports. There is £18 million of public investment in the growth deal for that site as well. But we're flipping that on its head. It can't be a traditional inward investment model. We now have community wealth building as our lens for economic development. And any public investment in that site needs to be done through, I would imagine, a joint venture where we capture some of the financial returns back for the public purse as part of that public investment. And the final thing is obviously derelict buildings in our high streets and in our communities. We've got an example of bringing a listed building at the heart of Irvine High Street, the King's Arm former pub, back into council ownership. And again, we're looking at converting that into council housing.
No, I was going to say, is it just a little bit of rain or is it bucketing it down? No, it's bucketing it down here.
I think it's bucketing down where you are, Bob, yes. And final thing is, I think we want to do a lot more of that, and I think it could be helped if we had strengthened powers on such matters, moving away from compulsory purchase orders to compulsory sales orders. And I think that's the sort of thing that certainly I'll be lobbying for as part of the Community Wealth Building Act that is proposed in the Scottish Parliament. So I'm happy to end there, Lorne, and I probably failed to keep up with Neil, but kept it as brief as
First class, Joe. Thank you very much for that. And I think it's very encouraging to everybody listening, just what North Ayrshire Council is involved in. And I think I would also just do a wee advert for North Ayrshire Council. I see that you've published your annual report on community wealth building today. So it's worthwhile anyone who wants to have a read of that, just to see the amount of progress that you have made so far. So thanks for that. And thanks for the 3 introductory comments. We'll just maybe move on to some questions from myself, but then thereafter we're going to move on to some questions from the chat function from the audience. So be thinking about questions at this stage. Maybe one for Neil, because he hasn't had the opportunity to speak for a wee while there. I just, with your vast knowledge of community wealth building and the examples of the various pilot areas that are looking at it and taking things forward, I just wondered what impact you're seeing from community wealth building already having, and do you have any examples or kind of lessons learned?
Well, the best impact we've got now is where the community wealth building has been more mature, and that obviously is North Ayrshire, and the annual reports that have been produced today, I think, is testament to the hard work of Joe and all his colleagues and anchor partners in North Ayrshire, and there's examples there. I think the lessons we have here, broadly speaking, there's many examples, but I think the broad lessons here is that, this is hard work. A lot of this, it's the granular, it's day by day, chipping away at all those pillars that we talked about. And I would say, just reflecting a little bit in Scotland compared to elsewhere, Scotland's great at strategy. It's brilliant, at policy. It's the implementation, the delivery thing, I think that it's got a little bit more to kind of push on. So I think community wealth building is useful as a vehicle for practical delivery, because it sort of eats a lot of strategy for breakfast, it crunches a lot away and actually says, here's what you should be focused on in terms of economic, social and ecological justice. There's 5 pillars, get cracking on them. And the action plan that was produced that North Ayrshire are working to, and also all the other 5 pilot areas, are very much that practical thing. What can we do on Monday that turns the dial a little bit, and bit by bit, we kind of make the impact. But for anyone interested in what kind of impacts you get, I would implore you to look at the reports that North Ayrshire have put out today, which kind of say they're bespoke to North Ayrshire, but there's generic sort of lessons there of the kind of impact that's there. Just finally, I would say is that, clearly any legislation that takes place later on in the parliamentary term, that will need to be calibrated in a way that seeks to increase the speed and the scale and the amplification of those impacts. That's its core. This is not just about a legislation to say, oh, here's some nice legislation. Its aim is to actually, we can get these impacts, here's how you would go further and deeper with impacts, and this is how the legislation would help with that.
Okay, thanks for that, Neil. Obviously, in taking forward community wealth building, we're talking about some considerable transformational change in an approach to economic development. I just wondered about, is there any messages, and this is maybe to Liz and Joe, any messages about just the practical challenges of delivering community wealth building and how they might be tackled? Any observations at this early stage? Joe or Liz, anyone want to comment on that?
I'm happy.
I'm sorry, I couldn't unmute myself there. Oh, sorry, Joe.
Go first and then Liz.
Yeah, I was only going to save you there from your challenges and unmuting. I wasn't jumping in. I think you've highlighted an issue that Neil will recognise as well, Lorne, there, that this isn't traditional economic development, and people across an organisation like a local authority need to be kind of upskilled and do a lot of knowledge sharing around what is community wealth building and what is the power of their day-to-day job. It is very much about economic development in the economy, but there's people throughout an organisation the size of North Ayrshire Council who have the levers at their own disposal in their day-to-day job. So it's across teams like housing and waste, and anybody that recruits, or anybody that does a bit of procurement, or anybody that manages any of the land and assets that we own, have a role to play in community wealth building. So what we did when we worked with Neil and Cles way back in 2018, 2019, was we got the report from Cles and then spent a considerable amount of time with our senior managers and managers throughout the organisation, sort of letting them understand what we were looking to achieve through community wealth building, and Neil was a great asset in helping us do that. And I would say that that's one of the key learnings for me before you start to try and run with community wealth building with an organisation the size of a local authority. Spend the time and the resource to actually delve through your senior managers and get them to understand the power of their day-to-day job. I find that was one of the best decisions we took, Neil, in terms of taking that steady approach to getting the momentum built up.
Thanks, Joe. Liz, any thoughts on practical challenges that your members might come across?
Yeah. So I suppose, I mean, a number of things. I think, to be honest with you, there's almost like a kind of bit of a pressure around airtime, just because of what I was describing at the outset about, you know, all the different agendas that people working in local authorities, but also for some of the big agencies, you know, Skills Development Scotland, Scottish Enterprise, South of Scotland Agency, Highlands and Islands, etc. You know, they've been mitigating the impact of the pandemic massively over the last year, managing funds around that, you know, also this whole agenda around, you know, the green economy. And I think staff, as in so many organisations, people are really quite kind of exhausted and beleaguered. But nonetheless, I do get a sense there's a real appetite for this. Our events that we ran last year were really incredibly well attended. I mean, 100, 150 people at every single event, regularly coming along. And that wasn't just members, we were broadening it out. We gained membership as a result of that programme of events. So, you know, I think that what we're aiming to do, you know, we're working closely with CLES, still with Neil, with the Scottish Government. The Scottish Government are funding EDAS to get the message out there, essentially to help do what Neil is describing, translate all of that thinking and the policy and the learning into tangibles and practice, so to enable and help people to do this on the ground. And we're very clear as a board in EDAS that that's our role. You know, we create spaces for people to come in and hear about policy and share ideas and share learning, but then it's about what you do in terms of taking that out and making a difference in the role that you're carrying out. So I suppose, you know, we would see ourselves very much at the heart of this, in enabling that translation and that learning and that sharing. It's a massive part of our role, and you know, very clear that this should be at the heart in the way that economic development is being taken forward now. You know, even we shouldn't be looking at just the green agenda as something separate. Community wealth building clearly shapes that and creates that. There's massive potential there. So yeah, it's about leadership. And I think, you know, even recently, Neil and I we ran a session, a lunch and learn session with the leadership team at Skills Development Scotland. That's not necessarily an agency you would normally think of perhaps as engaging around community wealth building, but there's a lot of interest there. And likewise, the other enterprise agencies will be doing the same thing. So, you know, part of it's about championing, part of it's about, you know, carrying the torch for all this, but part of it is persuading people to do it. But I think the legislation, the ministerial attention, the government attention is going to help as well. So it's a combination of a range of supports, really.
Thanks for that, Liz. And that's a good cue to move us into maybe just talking about legislation. Do any of you have any insights into the forthcoming community wealth building bill, or alternatively, you know, what would you like to see contained in the community wealth building bill? I'll throw that out to anybody on the panel there.
I think in terms of insights, Neil's probably best placed to answer that one. But I mean, all I can say is it's fantastic that it's coming. You know, really welcoming the focus and the fact that this is actually happening. Thanks,
Liz. Neil, do you want to say a few words?
Yeah. I mean, clearly, you know, there's a lot of thinking that's starting to happen vis-a-vis the bill, and you know, these are important things, legislation, and you need to calibrate it correctly. You know, questions like, you know, whether it's obligations to do things, or is it more power to consider? And what is its touch points with other existing legislation and other proposed legislation? How it truly adds value and create a dynamism towards this agenda. So there's conversations taking place. I think above all, we need to, and that's why it's later in the parliamentary term, we need to build and consult and build a consensus around this as much as you can do, and make sure that all parties are heard and have views heard on this and feed into this process. So, I mean, you know, we're in that development stage of it, I suppose, and I think the question is that with all legislation, wherever it is in the world, you need to calibrate this effectively. You know, it's very much the cherry on the cake rather than the whole cake itself. Do you know what I mean? And I think that's the kind of key point here. but we're on with it, and you'll see in coming months and years, ramping up a fuller consultation process around it.
Good, Neil, thanks for that. And Joe, from your practical experiences over the last year or so, any thoughts on what you would like to see contained in a community wealth building bill?
Yeah, I think there's a load of things I would like to see in a community wealth building bill. And I think the first thing it needs to do is very much be focused on the economy and not be focused on another piece of community empowerment legislation. It needs to be about economic development. It does need to learn some of the lessons from those on the ground who are doing community wealth building, such as us in North Ayrshire. So we have a community wealth building commission where all the anchor institutions are members of it. But some of those anchor institutions are national bodies like Police Scotland and the Fire Service. They are committed at a local level to community wealth building, but many of the levers that we need to drive community wealth building forward are sitting at some corporate committee or board of Police Scotland and the Fire Service, and the levers just aren't there. So I think it needs to tease out what the experiences of these anchor institutions have been over the last few years in areas like North Ayrshire. And as I say, it just needs to needs to be an enabling piece of legislation rather than a top-down piece of legislation. Community wealth building is absolutely about local democracy and bottom-up economic development. So I would hate to see something which was another kind of centralising agenda from Edinburgh. So it needs to be enabling. It needs to lift some of the barriers, such as I said, the issue of compulsory purchase order versus compulsory sales orders, etc. So a whole wide range of issues I think we need to pick up in that bill. But Lorne, we are having early engagement with the Minister, Tom Arthur. He's we've invited him to come along to our Community Wealth Building Commission so that he can speak to the other anchor institutions, etc. And we've had early engagement with him. So we are very much looking to do that and help shape the bill rather than be sitting there at the side and passing comment. We'd very much like to be at the heart of it.
Well, thanks for that. I now see that a lot of questions are building up, so we'll kind of move on to some of the questions from the audience here. Now, picking up one here, first of all, it's just saying a lot of the land ownership arguments are very much linked to rural issues. How can we also put out the message there, community wealth building and the pillars of land ownership and property are an urban issue just as much as a rural issue? Any kind of thoughts on that?
I'll come in there, Lorne. Yes, it's a fantastic question, and community wealth building is for rural, urban, and bits in between. And of course, questions of community wealth building, well, land and wealth accrued from land, are actually even more pressing in urban areas, given that so much of rent, land appreciation often can disappear from these shores in terms of who owns the land and who owns the investments that takes place on that land. So there is quite significant questions for urban Scotland around land, ownership of land and wealth that's accrued. And also Joe touched upon it, I think Liz touched upon it as well, the whole issue of vacant derelict land and industrial, post-industrial Scotland, I think is a really fascinating area. And how do we think about opening the envelope of what we see as productivity, not just financial gain, but wider social, ecological and cultural gain from our land within urban Scotland. And that's very much in tune with the wellbeing economy agenda. So there is a, traditional economic development, we tend to see land as for development on it, and it has to bring a financial return. I think we need to think about local economic turn and those wider values that can be brought to our land. I mean, I think it is one for every individual in Glasgow. They're no further than 500 metres from a piece of vacant or derelict land. I mean, you just put your head around that. That's quite amazing. And just finally, Lorne, I don't want to go on, but in terms of community wealth building movement more generally beyond these shores, beyond Scotland, questions of land ownership in, say, South Chicago, and a growth of community land trusts, community housing development trusts, or what they call them there, is very, very important to the developing of that fine site in Chicago and how it's used to address racial an ecological injustice that takes place within South and West Chicago. So this is a global question of land value, and how do we make sure that the value is captured more by communities, and also brings land into different forms of usage.
Okay, thanks for that, Neil. Now, maybe going to pose this one to Joe, and this is a question I see has come in from Kirsten Gow, who I know is from the island of Jura, and this is from the small island perspective, and it's just how do we make sure small communities can take advantage of community wealth building without overburdening volunteers. Now, maybe Joe, you've got experience in the Cumbries. I know Arran's probably 5,000 plus population, but the Cumbries themselves. Any thoughts on that, Joe?
Yeah, thanks, Lorne, and thanks for the question. I think it is important when we think about this in the terms of asking community groups to take more ownership of the economy, that there is going to be a great deal of burden placed on their shoulders. I think what is important for our point of view as a local authority is that we are there to support, not work against people with aspirations. So I think the group on Millport, for example, have found a different type of culture and relationship with the council than they maybe previously would have had. As I said, we set up a community investment fund a number of years ago. Community groups are able to tap into that fund. They certainly did that. They got £200,000 early on. That's money that we have released to them as and when we have required it. So they're going away and putting in funding applications for other funders. And it's quite challenging to meet deadlines and meet the criteria for that. But our fund's more flexible. So when they've had to look at sort of cash flow issues, they've came to us and asked for support, and we've been able to release that cash. So I do think, again, it's not about us as a council or the local state controlling everything, and everything has to be developed by us. It's about us enabling people to take a greater share of ownership in their local economy. And just to add on to a wee bit what Neil had said, just as you say, we have got Cumbria and we have got Arran in North Ayrshire, so we do have islands and we do have sort of more rural settings. The issue of land is a massive issue on Arran. It is in so few hands. The issue of house prices, rents, accommodation, and an economy which is very much focused and based on tourism and hospitality is a massive challenge for some of the residents on the island, particularly young people who end up leaving the island because they see no opportunities to actually live on the island apart from living with their mum and dad. So we are actively building council houses again on the island, but we need to look at how we get more land into our ownership, and we are working with community groups about whether or not they can help facilitate the transfer of land to either the community ownership or to council ownership, so that we can build more genuinely affordable council housing on the island, which is then let through a local letting initiative so that local people actually get those houses as well. So it is a massive issue, and I think it strikes at the heart of community wealth building is different in every single area. And that is the case even in North Ayrshire, which the approach we take to community wealth building in Irvine in terms of land and assets, where we are a former new town with loads of land in public ownership already, to the approach we take on the island of Arran will be completely different.
Can I come in, Lorne?
Yes, indeed, Liz.
Yeah, just a couple of, just reflecting on what both Joe and Neil have been saying as well. I think, and also obviously the question in the chat box where it originated. I think certainly from an EDAS perspective, we clearly don't, we're not viewing this as purely a rural issue. We're quite clear about that. It spans the whole of Scotland, rural and urban. In terms of the work we do in the programme that we're putting together, we're very careful and very clear that we have contributions from people in both settings, and that actually we give examples, we share case studies, we share real practical examples of how to ensure this agenda is taken forward in all different types of communities, islands, mainland, you name it. So I think we see our role as very much as kind of amplifying and making sure that the message is out in different contexts. I suppose the other dimension. This is what I was saying at the beginning, where I think our role is very much to bring in kind of different players, organisations perhaps that wouldn't necessarily, as I say, identify themselves as being purely economic development. We tend to think of obviously the agencies and local authorities as being the drivers of economic development, but we're bringing people in from other organisations who can support actually some of those challenges that that Joe's just been responding to. Whether that be, there are a lot of third sector intermediary organisations out there who are able to support volunteers, who are able to support people who are looking to establish development trusts. I mean, DTAS, for example, Social Enterprise Scotland, Community Ownership Scotland, a whole range of bodies that are there to really help facilitate that. And we're bringing them to, in our work, in our programme, to almost a new audience, because it's, a lot of people perhaps working in the public sector or working in for some of these larger agencies wouldn't necessarily know that these bodies exist, or wouldn't have naturally aligned or gone to them to help support the work or them taking forward community wealth building. So I suppose we're trying to facilitate some of those connections and build those partnerships to make the practice around this become a reality from the ideas and the vision.
Thanks for that, Liz. That's most helpful. Now, can I just make a reassurance at this stage, because there's a lot of questions coming through, that we will endeavour to answer them, and I'm maybe making a plea to my colleagues in the Land Commission who are in the background looking after the technical aspects, that we do record all these questions so we can hopefully get back to individuals if they email in to info@landcommission.gov.scot. Now, I'm trying to scan through the questions, and some of them already have been covered, might not be precisely, but some of the subjects have been covered. So if I can just move to kind of quick answers, if I can say that to the panel there. Is COSLA involved in spreading the word to others about community wealth building, Neil?
Yes, they are. They're a key stakeholder, though, of course, like many of the key stakeholders, need to deepen and harden that as the movement grows. But yes, they are.
Good. And can the panel comment on community wealth building in terms of capital and then revenue budgeting, which seems to drive public spending? Any thoughts on that? Just one person, please.
I don't differentiate between revenue and capital in terms of the approach to community wealth building. I think that there's a need to look at every pound of public spending through a community wealth building lens. I think where it does make a difference is some of those big capital projects. You maybe get more notice that that's coming down the line, and there's a bit of work there to make sure that your local business base are ready to actually bid for and compete for some of those contracts.
Thanks. Maybe one to Liz here, and I'm just kind of paraphrasing this one, but it seems to be a question that's saying that, are we going to tap into the knowledge which is already there in community-owned enterprise, social enterprises, cooperatives, who also have, an existing great knowledge on community wealth building in the wider sense in taking this forward?
Yes, absolutely. And I think actually in terms of my last response, that was, maybe didn't mention those organisations specifically, but that's what I'm trying to emphasise, that we want a whole array of voices and contributions. And we're not starting from scratch. I mean, I'm aware even from the social housing work that I used to do years ago, essentially community wealth building was happening in those locales by some of those very forward-thinking social housing bodies and housing associations that existed. But we're talking about, as Neil has said, this is about altering the way that economic development is thought about, is planned, is developed, is invested in, and at scale. And actually it's at the heart. It doesn't sit as an adjunct or an add-on or almost a tick box if it's a nice thing to do. So it's bringing it much more into the centre. So yes is the answer. And we've already involved a number of those organisations in our programme, but would welcome their input in the programme going forward.
Okay, thanks for that. And maybe trying to bring in a different dimension here. Somebody is raising the point about in urban areas, there is also a poverty in the quality of the environment sometimes. And just wondering whether that adversely affects the community health and well-being in many of these areas. Neil, any thoughts on that?
Yes, and that connection is that's very sad and true. And what's encouraging, and it's a link that Esther put in the chat there, is that health boards and NHS Scotland, Public Health Scotland have been quite enthusiastic supporters of community wealth building, primarily because they understand that the economy is a determinant of ill health. And simply, if people get a job or have more money in their pockets, they're less likely to be ill. That's crude, but there's a truth there. And so it is very much important that community wealth building is seen as a mean by which we tackle some of the long-standing ingrained injustices in Scotland and deprivation in Scotland by kind of recalibrating how the economy works and who it works for.
Okay, thanks for that. There's also a comment here about the importance of anchor organisations. Obviously, we've talked a lot about local authorities and maybe some of the enterprise agencies and things like that, but there's also the dimension of health boards, and obviously many health boards have extensive land and property. How do they get involved and their approach there? Any thoughts on that one?
NHS Ayrshire and Arran are a key anchor in our Community Wealth Building Commission. They've been actively involved since sort of day one. I think a bit like Police Scotland and the fire service, so they need to untangle themselves for some of the sort of national frameworks that they procure from, for example, and they need to look at maybe different ways of recruiting people and offering stuff like modern apprenticeships, etc. And then, as you mentioned, I don't think they've ever really been in the field of thinking about their publicly owned land and assets beyond just the kind of capital value of that asset. So very much, I think, a work in progress with the NHS, but we have a full range of anchor institutions involved in our community wealth building work in North Ayrshire, including the third sector, and it's about building that out and giving everybody a role in terms of driving this agenda forward.
Okay, thanks for that. I think I'm just scanning and seeing we've got one here. The conversation so far has framed wealth in traditional economic terms. We need to think of wealth in social, human and natural capital terms around the wider benefits they can provide to people that aren't just measured in pounds as we transition to a well-being economy. Anyone want to take that one?
I think that's been mentioned a few times, Lorne, and I think I did mention in my opening 5 minutes that we need to raise the bar on that and not just look at the sort of monetary value of our land and assets. I mean, Neil will know that in North Ayrshire, we have started to consider the impact of community wealth building, not just in traditional economic metrics, but looking at issues such as health and life expectancy and pay and other things, maybe looking at the donut economics model from Kate Rayworth and try to sort of use that in a sort of local aspect. So absolutely, we need to start measuring the economy very differently. It's a new economic model. We can't use GDP and GVA and all the traditional metrics as a way of analysing our performance.
Good. Thanks. And my colleague Kathy has highlighted that there's an event tomorrow that will look at the role of the National Health Service's state in supporting community well-being. So she put up a link for that. Maybe just one final question, because I'm conscious of time there. Should community wealth building practice support be offered to planning authorities to enable them to incorporate community wealth building expectations into planning application decisions? Any thoughts on that?
I think that goes back to what I was saying earlier on about the need for leadership on this, so I would say my answer would be yes. But I think in terms of all dimensions where economic development takes place, we need to get in at the leadership level, because it's at that level we need to have the buy-in in order to shape how planning and decision making is undertaken. So absolutely, yes, would be my answer.
Okay, well, thanks for that. Now, I am conscious of time, so maybe, I'll give this a further reassurance that we'll go through all the list of questions there, and hopefully if you're able to email these questions in, they can be responded to if you email to info@landcommission.gov.scot. Now, I know that my colleagues in the Scottish Land Commission are developing guidance for community wealth building in relation to the land and property pillar. And I know that some of the panel are involved helping us on that task ahead. So hopefully that will be ready in the coming months. It will be closely aligned to the land rights and responsibility statement that's been taken forward by the Scottish Parliament. Well, I think that this topic of community wealth building is one that has generated a lot of interest and will also grow in importance as the community wealth building economic model is rolled out further throughout Scotland, also with a bill being taken forward by the Scottish Government, this subject will have increasing importance. So thank you to all the speakers, to Neil, to Liz, to Joe. Thank you to the behind the scenes staff of the Scottish Land Commission, keeping the technology right, keeping me in check. And thank you to the audience for joining this discussion session. I hope you have found it both enjoyable and informative. And thanks, great to see so many people signed up. I think at one stage it was about 127, so that's fantastic. Thanks very much indeed. I hope you have found this informative. Thank you.